Welcome to the CDL Evolving Energy webinar series. My name is Florence van der Tuin and I'm the office manager at CDL. I also support client relations and help drive business development opportunities. It is my pleasure to welcome you and open today's webinar. Today's session focuses on the economics of geological carbon storage. As Canada advances its carbon management strategy, carbon capture, transportation, and permanent storage of CO₂ play a key role in achieving climate objectives. In part 2 of this webinar series, we will explore cost modeling of CO₂ storage and the broader CCS value chain, highlighting key economic considerations for developing these projects. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is being recorded and all attendees have been muted. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A panel or the chat throughout the presentation, and we will address them afterwards. CDL has been actively involved in energy initiatives spanning oil and gas exploration, development, CCUS, critical minerals, geothermal, and emerging energy opportunities across North America. We are excited to continue expanding these conversations through future webinars and technical releases. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenters, Matt Scorah and Rebecca Modler. Matt Scorah brings over 20 years of business and technical expertise across decarbonization, energy, fuels, and petrochemicals. Prior to joining Canadian Discovery, he served as Chief Technology Officer at Nautical Energy, where he led initiatives focused on low-carbon hydrogen, energy systems, and CCUS. His experience spans technical development, financing, commercial strategy, regulatory processes, and project management, giving him a well-rounded perspective on advancing complex energy projects. Joining him today is Rebecca Modler, a research engineer at NRCan CanmetENERGY in Ottawa. Rebecca specializes in techno-economic analysis, life cycle assessments, and technology development to support industrial decarbonization. She contributes to the National CCUS Assessment Framework, helping enable infrastructure planning for carbon capture and storage across Canada. We are very much looking forward to today's presentation, and with that, I will now hand it over to Matt and Rebecca to get us started.
Thanks, Florence. All right, so in this webinar, we're going to be picking up from last week's session where Krista and John provided a really great overview of the geological work completed as part of the Atlas. They also dove into the details of an example basin, the Scotian Basin. But today we'll cover a little bit of the Atlas as an overview in case you missed the previous session. But really the heart of this presentation here, we're going to get into the CO₂ storage cost modeling, and then Rebecca is going to cover the full CCS value chain modeling. Now, the project was led by Canadian Discoveries. We provided the geoscience expertise along with the overall project management to advance the work. The modeling of the full CCS value chain, those economics, that was undertaken by CanmetENERGY. They are an R&D organization within Natural Resources Canada, focused on advancing clean energy, low carbon technologies, and sustainable resource development. Additional support was provided by Deep Sky, providing technical reviews, supporting project communications. Deep Sky is a carbon removal project developer. They're really focused on building and operating infrastructure to capture CO₂ directly from the atmosphere, so that's STAC, and store it permanently underground. Funding for the project was provided by Natural Resources Canada, Deep Sky, and Canadian Discoveries. So if we look at the span of the project, we investigated CO₂ storage in a fairly large geographical area covering Quebec and Atlantic Canada. We looked at both on and offshore CO₂ storage targets. At the outset of the project, we started by screening basins to determine what level of assessment could be completed. The assessment was dictated really by the availability and the quality of accessible data. So we relied heavily on publicly available data sets, and to a certain extent, other data sets that could be purchased. What's shown here is green basins, there where we were able to acquire sufficient high quality data that allowed us to complete a quantitative analysis. Yellow basins were evaluated qualitatively. So we had some data to warrant a discussion, but really not enough to complete the full calculations. And then red basins, we had little to no data. Now, just as a reminder, there are many different types of geological storage, each at varying stages of technological and commercial deployment and readiness. Our project really focused on what we're showing here, types 1 and 3. So that's storing CO2 in depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs and in deep unused saline aquifers. They're really two of the most advanced and proven methods for geological storage of CO2. Now, if we think about the workflow of the project, we can really break it down into 4 fundamental steps, as we're showing here. I previously mentioned we started first off with the basin screening, look at data availability and the quality of that data. That's quite important as well, not just the availability, but the quality. And that allows us to determine what type of assessment, if any, could be completed. And that's all governed within, of course, the project budget and schedule constraints. From there, the geoscience team worked on mapping the basins, determining all the required inputs and data in order to complete the storage volume calculations. And when we really look at the span of our project, it's really steps 1 and 2 that represent the lion's share of the project efforts, not only in terms of budget, but in terms of schedule. And so I mentioned parts 1 and 2, or elements 1 and 2 of the workflow. That was covered in the previous webinar by John and Krista, and the recording will be online shortly in case you missed it. So now, it can be difficult to distill the thousands of hours that were invested into the screening, the mapping, the geological work, and the assessment of the basins. But if we had to do it, I think this slide provides a really great overview. 7 basins with multiple stacked formations were assessed quantitatively. We had another 8 basins that were qualitatively assessed. We find multiple targets with hundreds of megatons of storage, sometimes gigatons of storage. And in most cases, we find good regional seals. However, there can be areas where a viable seal is a little bit more questionable. Reservoir properties, when we take a look at the span of the basins, it really can vary from great to poor, not only varying basin to basin or formation to formation, but also location within the formation. And now we always want to point out that our work is regional level analysis. So our data values, they're derived from models that are calibrated to observe data. And while we find these models are good at predicting on a regional scale, it does kind of smooth over some of the local heterogeneity. So what it means is that there could be potentially sweet spots localized within a basin that on average won't get picked up. And of course, the opposite is true. We could have a basin that's identified as having great reservoir properties. There could be localized spots where there's poor reservoir quality. So within the atlas, you'll find maps and figures for each of the qualitatively assessed basins, providing a variety of data sets that ultimately result in this finished product, the stacked prospective CO2 storage resource. Here we have the resources shown as megatons per square kilometer. Darker colors represent a higher storage. So these help to guide you between the various basins and in terms of comparison, but also areas within a basin that are potentially more favorable than others. So for the webinar today, Rebecca and I, we're going to dive into steps 3 and 4. First, I'll start with the modeling of the CO2 storage costs. Now, if you've ever tried to search for CO2 storage costs, you're going to find that there's a wide range of reported values. And that can be attributed to a number of factors. That could be differences in methodology. Sometimes you'll find folks have used factored estimates, or it could be a bottoms-up cost estimate. There could be variations in what did the scope entail, what is the project scale, and there are many other factors that we'll get into a little bit later. However, we really go back in time. We can see that some of the first reported costs for storage were relatively optimistic. We were thinking we could get anywhere from $1 to $8 US per ton of CO2 stored. Over time, we see those reports where the costs are increasing, but also the range is widening. Increasing because the studies, we're getting into further details. The industry in general is gaining knowledge about what these true costs are. And widening because we start to consider that there are some fundamental project characteristics that greatly impact the cost of storage. So the previous slide, that was more like studies and reports. Now, if we try to, if we take a look at it and we get into what some of the projects have reported, we can see a little bit more of a variation. Now, it can be a little bit difficult because most projects report their publicly the data as the full CCS value chain. So that's the capture, transportation, and storage. And so, to be able to back out the storage calculations and provide these indicative costs, we've had to make some assumptions or combine multiple data sets together. But I think in general, we can make the observation, most projects fall within that $10 to $30 per ton range. Where EOR projects, that's enhanced oil recovery, they're going to have lower costs. We find higher costs in projects, obviously, with challenging reservoir conditions, lower injectivity, and of course, offshore settings. So when we compare storage costs between sources, we do see that large variability, and it's really important to consider some of the key cost drivers and ask whether or not we're making a fair comparison. So obviously the geological conditions play an important role. Does the target suffer from poor injectivity? That's going to present challenges and result in higher storage costs. The target type, is it a saline aquifer or a depleted hydrocarbon pool? A depleted pool could offer existing infrastructure that could be repurposed, reducing capital costs. Or it might have many legacy wells. That's going to require remediation to ensure they're not a path for leaks. The setting, such as on or offshore, that has a major impact. Usually offshore, as a rule of thumb, is 4 times the cost of onshore. But other factors like project location, are we building in Eastern Canada or the US Gulf Coast, where labor efficiency, rig availability, climatic conditions, all these things are going to influence the costs. The full life cycle, is the storage cost representing the entire life cycle of the project or not? Well, the next slide will get into a little bit more of those details. And then, of course, financial assumptions that can vary from industry to industry or company to company, and they do influence how that gets wrapped up into the magical dollar per ton estimate. So looking at the full life cycle of a CO2 storage project, we really need to consider all the various stages. This Atlas project is really here at the regional screening, really at the outset. We provide the foundational work that others will be able to use to move on to the next phase, which is really screening for sites for CO2 storage. But to be representative of the full life cycle and get a cost estimate that's comprehensive, we need to consider the early development activities, that's site selection, initial characterization, your feed work, including obtaining the required environmental permits and regulatory approvals. Capital costs, we need to include test wells, injection wells, monitoring wells, MMV hardware, everything else that's required. And then, of course, during the operating phase, we've got the cost for power, staff, other expenses. And then 30 years, 50 years, or however long it is down the road, when the project is closed, there's costs there, and then the continuing monitoring costs. So when we started this project, we did look and canvass the market for the availability of tools, models, and software to be able to estimate CO2 storage costs. Some are free, others are paid. Really, we landed on Scott Pro. It's developed and is licensed by Carbon Solutions. If you're not familiar with it, I do highly recommend you go and check it out. It's a really rapid screening tool. It's designed to evaluate potential geological CO₂ storage sites, specifically in saline formations. It links reservoir physics, injectivity behavior, plume evolution, things like that, with detailed economics, all in a single fast-running framework. Really, we found it's the ideal tool to be able to do regional screening of basins of this type and compare storage sites. So using Scott Pro, we have a series of inputs. And as first a set of constants, and that's things that we held obviously constant across the analysis, being like injection period, the number of monitoring wells, even the maximum injection rate, capped at 1 million tons per year, which was a constraint of the software. Now, for each target formation, then we've got the variable data that was screened and loaded into Scott Pro. Now, bear in mind, Scott Pro was developed using a machine learning, and so it provides really reliable results within the ranges of data that it's trained on. However, the results are a little less reliable as we get outside of those ranges. And it's for that reason that sometimes there are these hard constraints on variable inputs and even limits on some of the constants. So what we find is that data points within a formation could be excluded. So for example, areas with extremely low permeability, less than 0.9 millidarcies, are going to be cut off. But in that particular case, we know that areas with very poor, low permeability are poor CO₂ storage targets, and it makes sense to exclude them. But as another example, the thickness, it's limited to a max of 220 meters. We definitely have formations in Atlantic Canada where the net sand thickness is in excess of 220 meters. So in that case, we just put a hard cap of 220 into the software to be able to get a cost estimate, realizing that the cost is likely an overestimation, and the target would likely perform better than what's being estimated. Now, the raw results from Scott Pro, we review them, we screen them, and in certain situations, adjustments are made. In the case of offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, a factor was included to account for the higher costs of installations in the region. That's primarily due to the presence of icebergs. In other areas, we found that when the permeability was extremely low or the target was very, very deep, we found that Scott Pro was overly optimistic, and so we made some corrections there. But in general, the results were used as is. Now, just a final mention before we get into the results, it's obviously important, the cost basis. So in the Atlas, all the dollars are reported in 2025 Canadian dollars. The cost is reported on a per ton basis. And how we do that is we take the capital cost, apply a capital recovery factor, divide by the annual injection rate, and then add the annual operating costs on a per ton basis. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the capital recovery factor, the CFR, it's really just meant to take the capital expenditure that's primarily happening during construction, and how do we portion that over the life of the project? It's meant to capture things like capital repayment, taxes, return of and on equity, and other measures. So you will find, as I mentioned before, that these financial assumptions do vary from industry to industry or company to company. As an example here, we're just showing the impact of the CFR going from 8% to 16%. We do see an increase of 20% in the storage cost on a per ton basis. So it can have an impact and should be considered when you're trying to compare references and sources. So getting into some of the results, here on the left, we have probability plots of the storage costs for each of the basins. So this is where we've amalgamated all the formations, if there are ones that have stacked potential. The majority of storage costs really fall within that range of lower to moderate, with a number of locations that really are representing high cost tails, primarily due to geological conditions. Across the basins, this can occur where the reservoir sand is very thin, so we have a limited storage resource. The target is very deep, so higher drilling costs, higher operating costs, or the permeability is extremely low, lower injection rates. So it definitely can be said that the economic feasibility of any CCS project, it's going to vary based on a number of variables. That could be stuff like the availability of grants, incentives, and credits, other forms of revenue streams. That being said, while the cost of the full chain needs to be considered, I think we can safely argue that CO2 storage costs in excess of $100 per ton are highly unlikely to be viable in the foreseeable future, or at least that's our opinion. So on the right, we have box and whisker plots generated for the various basins, and we've excluded the regions of high costs as being uneconomical. So the boxes give you the upper and the lower quartile. We plotted the data points as well, so you can see the distribution. You can see how, in some cases, like the Scotian and the Jeanne d'Arc, the JDA, we get quite a lot of the data in that upper and lower quartile. Well, some of the other ones have quite a wide distribution. All right. So now, if we take all that data and we map it out, we end up with the following results. So a few things to bear in mind. Here, where the costs above $150 are shown in gray. So still plotted, but kind of grayed out. You may notice that when you compare this map to the previous map where we showed the CO2 storage results, there'll be areas that are excluded or no cost results are shown. Essentially, the reason behind this difference is that we have areas where the data was excluded from Scott Pro based on its constraints. Primarily, those are due to low permeability and extremely low porosity, where we know they're poor targets anyways. Another point to note here is that we're showing the minimum CO2 storage cost at any given geospatial point. So if we're looking at a basin that has multiple stacked storage potential, we're mapping the lowest cost for any given target. Now, Scott Pro is not able to model stacked storage targets. So as we feel the results are conservative in these areas. So a project could hope to do better if it targeted the multiple stacked formations and achieve a lower cost. Now, each basin offers areas that we can safely say are in the mid-20s to $50 per ton range. Really, the Scotian, as you can see here, having consistently lower costs over a wide geographical area. In general, the onshore storage resources tend to have moderate reservoir properties, but they benefit from lower costs associated with onshore activities. The offshore resources, like the Scotian, the South Whale, and the JDA, they're going to be burdened with higher costs associated with the offshore, but they have much larger storage resources, better injectivity, and they greatly benefit from economies of scale. And then last point, in the case of the JDA and the South Whale, they also have to contend with the presence of icebergs, which definitely has an impact on their costs. Okay, with that there, I'll hand it over to Rebecca to talk about the full chain economics.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. Let's just make sure I get full. Perfect. So as Matt mentioned, the work I'll be presenting helps show how some of this data out of the atlas could be integrated into cost modeling that looks at the whole CCS value chain. There we go. So along with my colleagues here at CanmetENERGY Ottawa and the CanmetENERGY Varennes Research Labs, we've been working on developing the National CCUS Assessment Framework, or as we refer to it, the NCAF. So this is a decision support platform, and it helps with the strategic planning of CCUS projects across Canada. And we're looking at the entire scope of the network. So we're looking at the costs and the performance of performing CO₂ capture at industrial facilities, whether these are using fossil or biogenic sources that create their emissions. We're looking at how CO₂ moves from these facilities to storage, whether it's via pipeline, marine shipping, or rail. And then what are the costs and performance associated with storage, whether it's onshore or offshore. The model also has the flexibility to incorporate utilization options for CO₂ as well. So as we developed this framework, there were a couple of questions we were aiming to answer. Things like what would be the best CCUS or carbon dioxide removal strategy across Canada? What would be ideal CO₂ capture technologies on the individual emitter basis? What would we look at the best methods of transporting CO₂ from the facilities to the storage sites? And what CO₂ storage sites are needed and when? We're also interested in knowing how much does this really cost and how much does it cost across the whole value chain? And would this change over time? As our industrial processes change, the scope and the scale of emissions, or as we evaluate uncertainties in our reservoir capacity, injectivities, and costs, do we see our networks and costs changing up? So ultimately, this framework is here to help us work with partners and stakeholders to assess when and where CCUS is the best choice, and really use this model to help provide some forward-looking optimization of developing Canada's CCUS and CDR infrastructure. So for the work in the Atlas, we helped to provide 2 illustrative case studies using the data coming out of the geoscience data from the Atlas. So the first case was a provincial level study focusing on the Nova Scotia region. And then our second case was broader, a regional assessment across Eastern Canada, where we'd see cross-province movement of CO₂. For each of these cases, we used a 30-year study period, and we broke that up into 5 different periods, so each of these having a length of 6 years. The way that our model works is that we set a target amount of CO₂ reduction to occur in each period. So this is the amount of CO₂ that's captured and stored. We looked at all the emitters kind of in the scope of the case, and we started by capturing 20% of the total available emissions. And then for each period, we increased this by an additional 20%. So by the end, in period 5, we were collecting 100% or the full amount of emissions from the case study. The way that our model works is that it finds the lowest cost combination. So the solution that we'd see represents the minimized cost for the capture, transport, and storage combination required to meet the target reduction for the period. For the case of the study. And really what we were hoping to provide out of these case studies is to see how at a system level, how CCS can develop at a large scale, particularly in Eastern Canada, and how this may evolve over time. And I just wanted to emphasize that these results really are scenario-based, and they illustrate a possible set of outcomes under kind of the conditions of this analysis. So the results are by no means like a final optimized solution for what CCS would look like. Really, there's a lot of considerations that we can take into account on the costs and the factors in framing up the scope that could be incorporated into how we frame up this system. So the tool is designed to explore different trade-offs and approach things from a system level rather than to prescribe a single optimal solution. All right, so the first set of inputs that we need to define in the NCAF system is our capture facilities and the costs of those. For our tool, we're looking at modeling the cost of capture explicitly, and this is so that we can get the variability in costs, in energy and utility requirements, the different environmental impacts of the technology, all at the individual facility level. What we've done to build up our costing models is we've performed large-scale parametric studies using HYSYS process simulations. And we've paired this with detailed equipment sizing that we ultimately use to inform machine learning models. So when we say large-scale case studies, what we've done is we've run a broad range of inputs, and this means different flows of emission, different compositions, different temperatures and pressures, and they've been selected so that we can try and represent all the different types of industrial flue gases coming out of emitters across Canada. In our costing buildup, we've also incorporated different regional cost factors and emission factors. So things like utility costs, the labor and construction costs in different regions, and different grid intensities to try and best represent cost variability, emission variability across the regions. And then from this grounded in engineering data set, we've been able to train some machine learning models that can be used to more quickly predict the performance and costs and environmental burdens of a given facility or hundreds of facilities rather quickly. On the facility basis, we've worked off of the greenhouse gas reporting data set to use the list of facilities there, but have then further developed the representation of those emissions using archetypes that we've developed on different industry types. So for each facility, we have the option to break it down into multiple stacks, so anywhere from one to many stacks at a given site. And they have certain flue gas flows, temperatures, pressures, CO₂ compositions, moisture compositions, oxygen, all representative of the types of processes that you'd see at that facility. We also have the flexibility to take in site-specific data that stakeholders would be willing to provide on their facilities. So for this case, we initially started with over 100 facilities and 180 facilities in Eastern Canada, and we performed an initial costing and performance assessment on those. But before framing up the exact cases for the atlas, we further screened down our emitting sites. So in this map, the red dots represent the emitting facilities, and they match criteria of being under $200 a ton of CO₂, and that cost includes both the CapEx and OpEx portion of the capture process. And these sites also emit over 2.2 megaton CO₂ per year. So for the Eastern Canada, as shown, these red emitters, that's 71 different facilities. And for the Nova Scotia case, it would be 6 emitters that are a subset of that. The next input that we define for our model is the CO₂ storage, and this is where we were able to incorporate the great data coming out of the CDL Atlas. So the inputs that we need for our model are the estimated storage capacity. So we use the P50 estimates coming out of the Atlas. We need the injectivity rates of the region and also the costs of CO₂ storage. So as Matt showed earlier, these are kind of the basin costing maps. But what we did for the study is we picked some sub-site target locations within each of the basins to represent kind of a storage hub idea for the case study. So these are represented by blue dots in our maps, and they represent different offshore and onshore storage sites that we've considered in the cases. So they are around those dots is kind of a 10 to 20 kilometer radius of the area that we considered. So when we're saying things like this is the injectivity or the capacity of that basin, we're kind of meaning like the subset, the small hub that we are considering within the broader scope of the basin. To be able to build up the costs associated with storage in these hubs, we did have to do an initial assessment on well spacing just to understand kind of the number of injection points that we could make. And we did this using some of the screening results coming out of the Scott Pro dataset, as well as comparing to currently operating storage projects. As well, just given the target locations that we picked, we were able to limit the costs to under $40 a ton, just given kind of the preferred locations that we picked within them. So similar to the context of the Atlas, this kind of approach is geared towards the regional assessments and is no means final well layout or injection strategy, but it helps provide us a basis to build up these regional level storage costs. The next step in our inputs is to understand how we can transport CO₂ between our emitters and our storage sites. So as part of the NCAF, we have a transportation tool, and it uses a multimodal system to model CO₂ transportation. So that means we're looking at pipelines, we're looking at rail, and we're looking at marine-based shipping routes. Our transportation tool will generate potential pipeline routing, and it uses cost-weighted spatial analysis that incorporates different terrain considerations. So rocky terrain, water bodies, protected areas, First Nations lands, and existing rights-of-way corridors to establish where potential pipelines might run. For our rail network, we're using existing Canadian rail infrastructure, and for the shipping routes, we're following marine navigation data. In terms of our ships, our model supports both transport ships from node to node, as well as injection ships that would allow for offshore injection from the ship. So this map here shows what a candidate network would mean for the Eastern Canada case. So we see, again, our emitters spanning in red. We've got storage sites in blue. We've got a couple port locations identified where we could switch up modes of transportation. So then what our tool does is it determines how to connect all those with the different modes of transportation. So in red, we've got some of our potential pipeline routes. In the gold, we're following the existing rail corridors. And in green are some of our potential shipping routes. So again, these are kind of all the options. And as we feed it to our optimization, it will pick some of the preferred or cost minimized options. All right, so speaking of the optimization, the tool that pulls all of these inputs together, the capture, the transport, and the storage, we call it our strategic planning tool. And it is a multi-period, multimodal optimization model, and it uses the cost inputs, our target volumes, and the phased timing that we've scoped in our case study to find the lowest cost network solution. And because of the detailed inputs that we feed into this model, our results are grounded in infrastructure and emissions data. So this is just an example to outline the difference between that candidate network that we looked at in the last slide and what an optimized network might look like. So from the nodes perspective, emitters and storage sites and ports that are in use are colored in, showing that they're part of the network, whereas ones that were not selected to be used, like these offshore storage sites, would be empty in color. And then all of the candidate routes are shown here in the dashed lines, with the selected low-cost transportation options shown kind of in the solid lines here. So what we've done with this tool and how it uses the advanced modeling and optimization engine can help support a variety of activities. So it helps with scenario analysis to compare build-out strategies and amongst different extensive decarbonization. It can help us plan infrastructure across different phases and scale-ups. We can look at optimizing transport across the different modes, and we can assess the impact of decarbonization policy initiatives. All right, so we will dig into some of the results from our two different case studies. I guess just to frame up what we're looking at here, each of these maps provides a snapshot in time of the different periods of the study assessment. So as we increase in periods, we're also increasing in the amount of CO₂ being involved in our network. For the Nova Scotia case, we were adding just under 1 megaton CO₂ per year in each additional incremental period. So what we see initially is red colored dot emitter. We're picking up the lower cost, larger emitters in the region. And we're looking to try and bring emissions to the closer available storage sites. So for the Nova Scotia context, I guess just to baseline, we've got a couple emitters in Cape Breton area, Truro, Windsor, Halifax. And then storage, we're considering a couple sites in the Magdalen, as well as the Scotian Basin. Given the presence of rail and the lower volumes, it did select that as the means of transportation, adding in pipeline where necessary to get into the hub. As we extend the amount of CO₂ we're looking to capture, we start to bring in additional emitters kind of along the corridor that we've already established, adding in again pipeline as needed to reach the rail network, and making use kind of the existing pathways established in the prior periods. Here by period 4, we're starting to bring in emissions from further out, and we have facilities that have been deemed port accessible. So at this scale, we see that there's sufficient volume to look at shipping transportation to our storage basins. And then if we look at the snapshot from kind of the end of the period, this is where we're collecting emissions from all the emitters. We are still using the Magdalene, but it was set with a max injectivity of 4.5 megatons, and we're now at 4.7. So the model is looking for somewhere else to store the CO2, and it's picked up on the Windsor Basin as having some capacity for additional CO2 volume. So what kind of seeing in the scope of the study is that maybe there is the potential for onshore storage to provide sufficient capacity and injectivity for smaller scale regional level assessments and networks. That said, the definition of the scope for this optimization in this case study does impact the model that we see. And so since we were phasing in volumes of CO2 and phasing in infrastructure, it was preferentially establishing those incremental additions to the network. Perhaps if we had seen a larger requirement of CO2 volume being required from the beginning, maybe we would have jumped to shipping transportation earlier. Maybe we would have seen pipeline. Maybe if we had assessed differences in sensitivities to the permeability, maybe we have risks we want to assess with onshore. Maybe that's when we start to see offshore integration as well. So lots of possibilities for the region, but this is one of the set of results that we're seeing for this case. For the Eastern Canada case study, we're looking at a much broader range of emitters and storage sites. So we're looking at emitters starting in Ontario, working all our way eastward. And then we're considering the storage basins in the St. Lawrence, the Magdalene, the Windsor, Scotian, South Whale, and Jeanne d'Arc. So now when we're incrementally adding CO2 into the network, we're adding about 12 megatons per year of CO2. That's pretty significant. That's multiple facilities being incorporated each period. We start off again with larger emitters, lower cost industries, typically in Ontario and Quebec, and are moving those towards the closest available onshore basins. So looking at the St. Lawrence and the Magdalene. Once we start to add in more emissions, we're starting to get the economies of scale and the volume of storage requirements that cause us to start looking at pipeline transportation to offshore basins. With more CO2 in the network, we're starting to pull in further emitters. These are higher costs relative to our starting emitters, scooping up emitters in Northern Ontario and Quebec and Southwest Ontario. And where emitters don't have direct rail access, which is perhaps a bit too zoomed out for that, we start to see small pipelines popping up to connect those to our rail network. And we're able to use, again, the onshore and the single hub in the Scotian. With more CO2 in the network, we're really picking up smaller emitters across Ontario and Quebec and scooping up more emissions in Atlantic Canada. And now the volumes of CO2 have us expanding our storage in the Scotian to a second hub and extending that by pipeline. If we look at the end, we're now capturing from all 71 emitters, and this is almost 60 megatons of CO2 a year, really large volumes that we're talking about. We've expanded to use the full capacity of the Scotian Basin as defined by our hubs. And then by capturing emissions in the Newfoundland area, we're starting to see some ship transportation into the Jeanne d'Arc region, as well as localized capture of the emitters here in offshore Newfoundland. So we can see kind of by these storage breakdowns that really all of the basins are being incorporated over the course of the study. The onshore emitters provide incentives due to their proximity and the costs, but the offshore really is offering large volumes of potential storage regions. Again, kind of just speaking to the dependence on the scope and kind of alternative assessments or things we could incorporate. like I said, these are really large volumes of CO2, and so this is quite a lot of movement of CO2 by rail. So assessing the differences between the modeled capacities and what actual capacities on these lines would be an assessment we could do. We could look at how the different storage reservoirs maybe would actually phase in as we expected permitting or regulatory allowances to let us inject in those periods. So again, lots of different factors and considerations to take into account in this kind of modeling work. We can pull together all the results of those time frame breakdowns and get a final cost breakdown for the different assessments. And so we're seeing in both the Nova Scotia case and the Eastern Canada case that the captured is a significant portion of the costs, almost 70 to 80% for both cases. But that's not to say that the costs of transport and storage aren't significant as well. Particularly with the transportation breakdown, we can see that the volumes, the modes of transportation that are being selected, and the timing of the investment in the infrastructure, it does change up across the results, and it can be impacted by the decisions and inputs put into the model. So really at the end of all this, both out of the work and data and costing coming out of the Atlas, as well as the use of the NCAF tool, what we're really hoping to do is help provide basis for developing business cases for decarbonization through CCS. And this focuses on Eastern Canada, but there's other regions that can be considered as well. From a techno-economic perspective, the NCAF supports multi-sector integration and optimization across the full value chain and can be used to help model phased approaches to network expansion. While the results that we show today are pretty high level and regional, the outputs from the NCAF do offer additional information like detailed CapEx and OpEx breakdowns, the energy requirements involved, different amounts of fleet sizing, and the overall emission reduction estimates that can be used in more thorough scenarios assessments. From a social and regulatory perspective, the data and the tools can help to establish the benefits of CCS in the regions, as well as understand the potential impacts, and can be used to help co-develop different regulatory frameworks required to develop these infrastructures. Together, this work helps support establishing strategies towards Eastern Canada CCS hub development and helps to coordinate information and assessments across industry and governments, and really allowing for integration with communities and relying on the regional leadership out of those areas. I'll pass it back to Matt.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's fantastic. So I think we mentioned before, but just repeat it. If you're looking to download the Atlas, please go right ahead. It's publicly available. You can download it all together or by chapter. So this link will be provided. Just some contact details, I guess, for Canadian Discovery and as well as NRCan. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank many of the project partners. This was very much a collaboration of efforts. So thanking for NRCan, Deep Sky for funding support. Thanks for CanmetENERGY providing the support there and the economic modeling. But as well, we had peer reviewers, we had folks from industry and contacts, folks from all the provincial governments that either supplied data or their time. So just very appreciative of that collaboration.